it's easy to get down on the potential threats that this Trump administration brings, but taking action is an antidote to despondency. And there's a bunch of local organizations, whether it's Surfrider Foundation, your local mountain bike group, or any sort of outdoor group that you're part of. Engaging with them and getting involved will make a difference.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. First, let me start by saying that the devastation from the wildfires in the LA area is horrific. Our hearts go out to everyone who has had to experience a climate disaster of any kind. And unfortunately, these events will become more frequent and widespread. We plan to discuss more about climate disasters and how to prepare for them in the future. But for now, we're going to focus on some policies that no doubt influence and contribute to fueling climate change. In episode 164 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are talking about offshore drilling. More specifically, we are going to learn about the intersection between outdoor recreation economies and how they're impacted by activities like offshore drilling. To help explain the scope of this issue, I had the pleasure of sitting down to chat with Chad Nelsen. Dr. Chad Nelsen is the CEO of the Surfrider Foundation, the world's largest grassroots coastal and ocean conservation organization dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of the world's oceans, waves, and beaches. Chad has over 25 years of experience in ocean and coastal conservation and works at the intersection of advocacy, ocean recreation, and grassroots organizing to confront some of our most pressing challenges, including climate change, plastic pollution, and poor water quality. With a geology degree from Brown University, a master's in coastal environmental management from Duke University, and an environmental science and engineering doctorate from UCLA, Chad has a strong foundation in science, policy, and management. Through his research at UCLA, Chad became a founder in his field of surfonomics, the study of the economic values of surfing and ocean recreation. Chad currently lives in Laguna Beach with his family and enjoys surfing, hiking, mountain biking, climbing, and snowboarding. After this interview with Chad was recorded, President Biden announced the withdrawal of the entire U.S. East Coast, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific off the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and California, and additional portions of the northern Bering Sea in Alaska from future oil and gas leasing. Taken under the authority of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, this permanently protects more than 625 million acres of U.S. waters from any future oil and gas development in 5-year offshore drilling plans developed by the federal government. Surfrider and Chad Nelsen released a statement about this on January 6, 2025. This statement reads, "The Surfrider Foundation applauds the Biden administration for withdrawing these waters from future oil and gas leasing. Offshore drilling is a dirty and damaging practice that harms our oceans, as well as our communities and businesses, while worsening climate change. President's historic action is a key step toward ending oil and gas drilling in U.S. waters. We call on our federal leaders to take further steps to ensure that all U.S. coasts are protected from this harmful industry." End quote. With that in mind, here is this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today, Chad. I am excited to have you here. I know a lot of listeners are probably familiar with the work that you have been doing. So to get us started, I guess, I'll ask my standard question, which is, how did you fall in love with outdoor spaces? And how does getting outside and enjoying nature fit into your life now?
Yeah, I feel very fortunate. I grew up in a surf town, which we'll talk about. So I grew up in the ocean. But my parents also took my brother and I camping in the Red Rocks Southwest. I live in Southern California, so it wasn't too far away. And I grew up skiing as well. And then almost 30 years ago, I met my now wife, and she was a very avid rock climber. So she got me into rock climbing. So now I do all kinds of sports, and I still do almost all of them today. So surfed a couple days ago, rode my mountain bike yesterday, and I'm off to ski next week. So I'm super active in outdoor recreation. And although I'm slowing down a little bit, I still love it just as much as I did when I was younger.
That's awesome. Yeah, you're in a perfect area for that. And I feel like maybe being raised by the ocean is probably what inspired you to pursue your current career. And we got a brief introduction of that at the start of this episode. But do you mind overviewing kind of how that transition happened, or how did you get into this line of work?
Yeah, so yeah, grew up as a beach kid. I was an ocean lifeguard. I also watched Southern California get massively developed and the impacts from that, from over extraction of fish to sprawling development that impacted water quality. So that's what sort of triggered my interest in environmentalism. And Surfrider, where I work, is just sort of a perfect fit to match my love for outdoor and ocean recreation with conservation.
Yeah, and that's why you're the perfect guest for this discussion. I was excited that we could connect. And so we can kind of just jump right into the topic, which might be a little bit, hopefully not too heavy for listeners. And it will be a good time to maybe prepare for what is to come. And so, what do you think, from your perspective and like the advocacy work that you do all of the time, what are the key climate and outdoor policy changes that you guys anticipate for the upcoming Trump administration? And I guess you could pull from what happened last time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know that sort of based on his previous administration and what he's done and what he's said, that Trump and the Trump administration is no friend of our environment. um, and they've promised a range of things from deregulation, eliminating some of our, or sort of shrinking some of our important natural resource and environmental agencies like the EPA and NOAA, and opening more land and water to oil and gas drilling.
Yeah, and so
So
if
I
we,
think,
oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. No,
No, you
no.
can continue.
I think we definitely have our work cut out for us. All of that said, you know, it will begin when he starts. And sorry, I'll say this again. It'll begin when he starts releasing executive orders, which sort of direct the agencies to do these things. We saw that last time. Maximize drilling offshore, eliminate national monuments like Bears Ears. And so at this point, it's still some speculation, but we more or less know what to expect. We just don't know the details of the plans.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that a lot of your work, as you've mentioned, dealt with the offshore drilling last term and kind of fighting against that resource extraction. I guess you probably focus on the offshore drilling because of Surfrider, but also the general resource extraction of the oil industry would be impacted. And so, if you look at that specifically, are there specific long-term consequences to that for the economy and, I mean, the environment as well? But I think Trump is hyper focused on the economy.
Yeah, and also, to be clear, almost all of the previous administrations that I can think of, Democrat or Republican, have tried to open areas to offshore drilling. So we opposed a Obama plan and a Trump plan and a Biden plan and back to a Trump plan. So it isn't partisan; it's actually bipartisan. And our feeling is we should be doing no offshore drilling. Um, this is important from a global climate change standpoint, but also for its impacts to our nearshore ocean and coastal environments and for the economies of coastal communities. Offshore drilling equals spilling. So they inevitably spill, despite claims that it's 100% safe, which is not true. And not only do the spills potentially have devastating impacts to these coastal communities, it also, the infrastructure that comes along with it, it's an industrialization of the coast, which is incompatible with most coastal communities which thrive on coastal tourism and recreation.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the fact that you have to oppose this with every administration, that this isn't necessarily like a new topic that's having to be that you're having to advocate against. But okay, so if we look at all of the administrations that you have worked with in the past, how does your current strategy moving into the new administration compare to previous ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the strategy is actually sort of the same. The difference in if you compare the different administrations has been sort of the extent of the effort. So, um, the Biden administration was trying to open up areas in Alaska and then the Gulf of Mexico, which are also areas that are being heavily drilled already. Um, the previous Trump administration tried to open up all coasts of the United States, so the West Coast, the Gulf, and the East Coast to drilling. And we're opposed to that. And the primary reason is that coastal communities have nothing to gain and everything to lose. So offshore drilling is a global commodity. That oil gets sold on global markets, so it doesn't change prices at the pump, which is a fake talking point, or create any more real sort of superiority, this idea of energy dominance, because that oil can be sold anywhere. It's only to the benefit of the oil and gas industry. Meanwhile, if you have a hotel, a restaurant, a surf shop, or you're a surf guide or a kayak guide or run a dive program, all of that offshore drilling threatens your economy and your business. And coastal tourism and recreation, that combination of all those things is by far the largest economic driver in coastal communities, and in fact is much, much larger than the oil and gas industry as a whole.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess I've never considered like the two side by side, which one maybe has like more of an economic influence. And you would assume that it would be the gas and oil industry, but that's interesting. And in a previous conversation, you definitely drew parallels between the ocean communities and then mountain towns. So we are talking a lot about ocean communities because that's where your work sits. But what are some other influential policies or actions that could then harm other communities that rely on that recreation and tourism economy?
Yeah, if you think about a surf town like Laguna Beach, where I live, or a mountain bike Mecca, like Moab, or a ski town, um, they're all people move to them, and their economy is dependent on tourism and locals recreating on public lands and waters. And so there's a lot of parallels in terms of who's there, why they're there, and how the economy operates, whether it's Laguna Beach or Crested Butte. And those economies and those communities, if they can keep their environment relatively healthy and intact, it becomes a renewable source of recreation and sources of businesses and jobs. Both could be threatened by drilling and mineral extraction, through mining. And in the case of coastal communities, it's typically offshore, and on land, it's these public lands and efforts to open up areas to mining and drilling. And so, the industrialization threatens the recreation and sort of the environment in these places. So I do think that there's a lot of similarities, and in many cases, it's the same sort of government agencies that are managing them or in parallel.
I think that a lot of listeners probably have a pretty good idea of the environmental impact of these types of drilling or mining, anything that might be in that realm. But for people that may be less familiar, what is kind of I don't know how to phrase it, like fallout or general impact of
Yeah.
you implement this thing and then what actually happens to those communities?
Yeah, and so sort of the thing that's most obvious that most people focus on is spilling, right? And so that could be oil spill offshore, like the big BP spill in the Gulf, or a very famous one in Santa Barbara in the late 1960s. That also happens on land at pipelines. There's regular pipeline spill, and those can contaminate rivers and waterways. there's the industrialization associated with the drilling. So there's refining, there's, in the case of the ocean, boats and ports, and on land, it's trucking. And, in the case of mining, it's obviously tearing up the hillsides. And then there's loss of access too, because if they get leases to do this, those areas, because they're hazardous, get closed off to people. So, that could cut swaths of areas that people use for recreation out. And it creates pollution as well. So it can impact air quality and water quality. So there's a sort of a variety of impacts. Some are sort of acute relative to spills, and others are more ongoing.
And Surfrider, you're not the only organization or government that is necessarily opposing drilling of any kind. So do you have other examples of organizations? I know you brought up before that Florida Republicans actually opposed the drilling during Trump's last presidency. So how do you think that we can kind of like come together, or are there other examples of this opposition that could help move the needle away?
Yeah, it's interesting. During that last effort to open up all coast to drilling, there was a really strong sort of coastal business coalition that came together. And there were tens of thousands of businesses representing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs, that opposed that plan. And because of the growing sort of opposition from coastal communities, from coastal resource or tourism and economic groups, chambers of commerces, visitor centers, ultimately, the senators of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, and the representatives came out and said, "Hey, we don't think this is a good idea." And there were actually efforts at the end of Trump's first term to pull those places off the drilling plan because of that opposition. And so what that showed me is that, this isn't necessarily a partisan issue. It's not a Democrats versus Republicans issue. It's really about supporting what is a really thriving coastal tourism and recreation industry in opposition to industrialization of our coasts, which benefits very few, but impacts the communities that are already there.
Do you think we'll see a similar thing with the people who have entered office or who are entering office with this coming administration? Do you think it'll continue to be that bipartisan support for against industrialization, or is it kind of like leaning one way or the other?
I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that the appointees that the Trump administration is making to the EPA, the Department of Energy, are sort of pro-extraction, pro-oil and gas, climate deniers. So that doesn't bode well on the executive branch, which is the president's side. Whether the senators and representatives from some of these coastal states will come out in opposition to this, I think it's too early to tell, but our goal is certainly to make a really compelling argument that this isn't in the best interest of their state to do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Adventuring plans on your calendar? Remember to grab your Lava Linens travel towel on your way out the door. Founded by a mother-daughter team, Lava Linens crafts durable, luxurious travel towels as a more sustainable and better performing alternative to microfiber and cotton towels. Powered by flax, hemp, and tencel, they're designed to be by your side for years to come. Use the code Outdoor Minimalist for 15% off your next order.
And so if we look at kind of the hierarchy of support or activism or local civic engagement, how can each level become more involved? Because I think there is a lot of frustration among outdoor enthusiasts and environmentalists that Trump is re-entering office, and also probably some fear. So yeah, that was a long-winded way to ask. What can we all be doing, and how can more organizations like Surfrider support? And then how do your organizations support federal and state policies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, the vote has happened, right? We're going to have a Trump administration, and And so it can be frustrating, and it's easy to feel that, to feel powerless when things are happening in Washington, D.C. But a lot can be done at the local level, and a lot can be done at the state level. So one example, when we were opposing offshore drilling, was that every coastal community in South Carolina passed a resolution in opposition to drilling. Now, that wasn't any sort of binding law, but what that signaled was that these coastal communities were opposed to this plan, and every single coastal community in the state signed on to that. And so all of a sudden, the governor of South Carolina and the representatives of South Carolina are starting to scratch their head and saying, wait, this is really unpopular in these coastal communities. And so all of a sudden, they're communicating to the Trump administration, hey, maybe South Carolina is not the place for this. So that's a good example of, and all of those local resolutions happened because, the folks that live in Charleston, South Carolina, rallied and communicated to their elected officials that this was something they were concerned about, and those elected officials agreed. So it really was a grassroots movement. This happens in mountain towns all the time in opposition to new development as well. And so I think there's a lot that can be done at the local level. And then some states also, the ocean's sort of unique, but state waters goes out to 3 miles, and then federal waters are from 3 miles out to 200 miles. But California, for example, opposed offshore drilling, not only in its 3 miles, but said you can't run your infrastructure through California's waters. So that made it harder to drill off the state of California because they can't pipe the oil onto the land to truck it or ship it out of a port. And so the states can also have a say in what goes on, just making it more difficult for something like this to happen if they're opposed to it. So, in some cases, coming out of the last Trump administration, we became more resilient to new drilling than if he hadn't proposed it at all because of these local and state opposition. So it tells, if you're frustrated by this or other things that are happening, I think getting involved at the local level is a way to make a difference, and also it gives you agency, right? You're now like, okay, I am doing something I can do that's within my purview and my power to try to make some change.
Yeah, I think getting locally involved can be really empowering. I think, at least in my experience, you kind of like see the results of that a little bit faster. Not saying that like other types of civic engagement are not as impactful. But I do think, like you said, it gives you a lot of agency, especially with these bigger ticket conflicts and policies. And so let's see, looking ahead then, what can advocates and policymakers do to build lasting protections for our coasts and then also public lands, regardless of who happens to be in office?
Yeah, there are sort of two things. I think, establishing more protected public lands, whether that's national monuments or new parks. California recently established something called the Chumash National Marine Sanctuary, which is a huge marine protected area off of the Santa Barbara coast. So whether it's on land or in the sea, creating more publicly protected designated lands is something I think that's really important. Surfrider is a member of a group called the Outdoor Alliance, who maybe you've had on the show, but they do great work in both getting public lands established, funding them, and getting good management. And I think those are all important elements to this.
Yes, Adam Kramer from Outdoor Alliance, he is the episode right before this. So if people want to learn about that, they can go back and listen to him speak on a more like maybe a slightly broader level outside of just ocean conservation. And if listeners want to learn more about Surfrider's work and support your efforts, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, surfrider.org is the best place to go, or find Surfrider on the socials. We have 200 chapters and clubs on every coast in the United States. So if you live in a coastal town or coastal state or jump on the water occasionally, I encourage you to connect locally and see what we're up to in your favorite beach town.
I love that. I will be sure to include the links to all of that in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. But with that, Chad, thank you so much for taking the time to educate us on this important topic today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.